Welcome to Reformed Thinking, the deep dive where we take significant texts, strip away the academic dust, and figure out what the central message means for you. Today, we are undertaking a really critical deep dive into material that shaped centuries of theological thought.
It really did.
We're looking at an excerpt from John Calvin's monumental work, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. And we're going right to the beginning, Book 1, Chapter 2. This is where Calvin lays the absolute groundwork for how we understand our Creator and, critically, our relationship to him.
The foundation for everything that follows.
Absolutely. The core question Calvin addresses right out of the gate is not only critical, but I'd say definitional for human life. What is the knowledge of God, and what purpose does that knowledge fulfill? For him, this is never a casual philosophical thought experiment. It's a living obligation, a command that should dictate, every aspect of human existence, from private thought to public action.
That's right. You read the source material, and you quickly realize this chapter is the foundation upon which the rest of the Institutes is built. Our mission for this particular deep dive is clear.
Okay, let's hear it.
We need to extract the crucial distinction Calvin draws between simply knowing about God, the mere intellectual assent that a being exists, and possessing a pious knowledge of him.
It's the difference between having data and having a relationship.
That's it exactly. We need a clear, actionable understanding of why Calvin so tightly links all genuine knowledge of the Creator directly to specific actions, obligations, and most critically, reverence. If we grasp this initial point, we understand the theological engine that drives all of Reformed thought.
Okay, let us unpack this essential starting point. When people begin thinking about God, they often start with simple recognition. I believe there is a supreme being.
Sure, that's the common starting point.
And it's tempting to think that simply believing in a deity checks the box, that we've, achieved knowledge. But Calvin says we need much more than that vague intellectual concept. He demands substance.
He does.
So when we talk about the scope of proper knowledge, why does Calvin move so quickly past that initial recognition? What makes mere acknowledgement so insufficient?
Well, what's genuinely interesting here is how Calvin immediately dismisses that minimum bar. He insists that the knowledge of God is not just recognizing that there is a God.
Right.
If that were sufficient, even the most rebellious or self-centered individual could claim true knowledge. It's the bare minimum, and Calvin knows it's dangerous because it breeds complacency.
So what's the next step?
He argues that proper, true knowledge requires grasping two related things simultaneously, and this is where the distinction becomes fascinating. The two requirements cannot be separated.
Okay.
First, we must understand what is suitable for God's glory. He uses the phrase, what befits us and is proper to his glory. This addresses the objective truth about God's eternal majesty, his attributes, and his intrinsic worth. It's knowledge about the object itself.
And what's the second part, the subjective requirement?
The second component pulls the knowledge directly back into the human experience. We must grasp what is to our own advantage to know of him. This is not a detached academic pursuit where you study God like a distant star. This brings the knowledge back to the practical and relational realm. How does knowing God's glory fundamentally change our status and our actions?
So the knowledge is inherently self-implicating. If I know God's glory, that knowledge must translate into a recognized advantage for myself.
Yes.
But if knowing God's glory is the objective part, how does that knowledge become an advantage to the listener? What does Calvin mean by advantage here?
That is a central question that separates Calvin from, say, philosophical deists or intellectualists. The advantage isn't material gain, but ontological grounding.
Ontological grounding. Okay.
When you recognize God's boundless might and perfect wisdom, his glory, the advantage is recognizing that you have an anchor outside of yourself. Your advantage is finding truth, stability, and purpose. If the knowledge of God doesn't compel us to adjust our position relative to him, moving from self-rule to submission, it's functionally useless because it fails to deliver the only true advantage: reconciliation and dependence on the good source.
That reframes the entire purpose of theology. It's not knowledge for knowledge's sake. It's knowledge for reorientation's sake.
Precisely, and this leads to his critical premise regarding prerequisites. He states plainly that without religion or piety, God is not properly known.
He makes it a requirement.
He establishes piety not as an optional addition, but as an essential requirement for genuine comprehension. Without that specific disposition, the knowledge we hold is incomplete or, worse, corrupted. We may have all the theological data points, but if we lack the framework for reverence and relationship, We've simply invented a manageable God.
And I wonder if that sounds slightly circular to a new listener. Are we saying you must already be pious to know God truly? How do we acquire this prerequisite piety? It can't be a virtue we just manufacture through sheer willpower.
That's a fair challenge, and Calvin addresses it by defining the source of piety. Piety isn't just religious performance or external acts. He gives us a precise, active definition. Piety is that reverence joined with love of God, which the knowledge of his benefits induces.
I find the structure of that definition compelling. It's not just fear, and it's not just love. It's the two joined together, reverence and love.
Right.
And they're bound by a specific recognition. That recognition is the operative mechanism. The disposition of piety is induced.
Yes, the word induces is the engine. This disposition stems directly from recognizing God as the fountain of every good. We must be thoroughly persuaded that we must seek nothing elsewhere than in him.
Nothing.
This conviction is the intellectual foundation that leads to the emotional and volitional response we call piety.
Huh.
If you believe God is the sole source of everything desirable, then seeking him and revering him is the only logical response.
So, if the intellectual foundation is the recognition of God as the fountain, let's elaborate on that concept, the flow of goodness. How comprehensive is this idea for Calvin? Does he leave any room for human autonomy in creating good?
Zero room. Absolutely none. This is one of the most comprehensive claims in the Institutes.
Okay.
Calvin argues that no drop will be found, either of wisdom and light, or of righteousness, or power, or rectitude, or of genuine truth, which does not flow from him and of which he is not the cause. This statement eliminates any corner of existence, any human endeavor, where we might claim self-sufficiency or self-originated goodness.
Wow.
Think about the implications of that statement for a person's life.
Yeah.
If you achieve professional success, where did the intellect, the opportunity, the strength, and the luck come from? If you possess moral rectitude, where did that standard and the ability to maintain it come from?
Right.
Calvin insists that every single desirable attribute, every bit of light, wisdom, and righteousness originates entirely from God.
This radical dependence must lead to a specific action, doesn't it? If I truly grasp this idea that all good flows from him, I can't continue living as if I'm the source.
Precisely. The resulting action for the knowledgeable person is clear and unavoidable. We learn to await and seek all these things from him, and then, thankfully, to ascribe them, once received, to him.
Ascribe them to him.
This completely reorients the human perspective from one of arrogant self-reliance to one of radical dependence and continual gratitude. This grateful ascription is what moves the knowledge from sterile theory to living piety.
And this grateful dependence naturally flows into what Calvin calls willing service. This is the core motivation for religious observance. If I've ascribed all goodness to him, service ceases to be a burden and becomes a response.
Piety is the fit teacher of religion because it dictates how we respond to that knowledge. Calvin argues that men will never yield God-willing service until they recognize they owe him everything.
And why would they owe him everything?
Because they are nourished by his fatherly care, and they recognize that he is the author of their every good.
Yeah.
It's not an imposed legal obligation. It's a joyous, grateful debt for sustenance and grace received.
A joyful debt. That sounds like a paradox. How does Calvin differentiate this willingness from a legalistic obligation where you serve just to avoid punishment or earn reward?
The distinction lies in the internal motivation tied to our summum bonum, our highest good. If you serve God only to check a box, you're serving yourself, using God as a means to an end. But Calvin argues that a person only gives themselves truly and sincerely to him when they establish their complete happiness in him.
Complete happiness.
If your complete satisfaction, your highest good, lies anywhere else in wealth, power, reputation, or self-actualization outside of him, the service you render will always be conditional, partial, and insincere. You're using God as an assistant to your real goal.
That's a powerful image.
Piety demands a complete internal realignment, where God is the sole source of fulfillment, making service a natural outpouring rather than a forced transaction. This challenges classical philosophical models that sought the highest good in earthly virtues or civic life. Calvin drags that concept back to the divine relationship.
That makes the stakes very high for the knowledge we possess. It determines whether our life is genuine religious service or simply a self-serving masquerade.
It does.
That clarifies the absolute necessity of piety and the framework of seeking and ascribing all good to the Creator. But Calvin acknowledges that the human experience of this knowledge is not uniform across history or context. He makes a key distinction regarding the knowledge of God that accounts for the reality of the fall.
This is where Calvin demonstrates his theological precision. recognizing that the current human experience of God is marred. He starts by describing the ideal. He introduces the idea of the simple and primal knowledge. This is the knowledge to which the very order of nature would have led us if Adam had remained upright. It's the original, uncorrupted understanding available to humanity before sin, a pure apprehension of the Creator.
This primal knowledge focuses purely on God as creator, perceived through what we often call general revelation. In the fashioning of the universe and in the general teaching of Scripture, the Lord shows himself simply as the creator.
Yes. In this first, simpler aspect, we would immediately feel and know specific attributes of God that relate directly to our existence. Calvin says we would feel that God supports us by his boundless might, governs us by his wisdom, nourishes us by his goodness, and attends us with all sorts of blessings.
Those are the immediate existential confirmations of a loving, capable, and meticulously involved maker.
It's the spontaneous recognition of dependence and goodness that a sinless being would experience.
And it's not just sustenance. It extends to governance and justice. In this creator knowledge, we also see that he rules mankind by his righteousness and judgment, that he bears with us in his mercy and watches over us by his protection.
Right. These attributes define our relationship with a perfectly just and merciful sovereign who actively guides and guards his creation. There's no perceived conflict between his justice and his mercy. They simply define the perfect sovereign.
But as you pointed out, we are not in that unfallen state. If the simple knowledge is beautiful and whole, what happens to it when we consider the current human condition? The primal knowledge is insufficient now.
Indeed. In this ruin of mankind, our experience of God is fundamentally and tragically altered. The primal knowledge, while still available through creation, becomes twisted by our internal guilt and fear.
How so?
No one now experiences God as Father, author of salvation, or favorable in any way if they only rely on what creation shows them today. Instead, they feel the crushing weight of his righteousness and judgment without the comfort of his attending blessings. They know him primarily as judge.
That's a scary thought.
It is. The creation still testifies to his glory and power, but because humanity is ruined, that testimony evokes terror rather than pious reverence. The fear is no longer the healthy, grateful reverence of piety. It becomes crippling dread and an impulse to flee.
That's a deep theological crisis. If we only see God as the righteous judge ready to execute judgment against our ruined state, how can we ever approach him or seek that essential knowledge that leads to complete happiness?
That state of estrangement persists until Christ the mediator comes forward to reconcile him to us. This is the crucial hinge point.
The mediator.
The chasm created by the fall can only be bridged by a mediator who can address the justice of the Creator while extending his mercy. Without this mediation, the revelation of God's glory remains entirely terrifying to the guilty conscience.
This means the second type of knowledge must embrace the grace of reconciliation, showing God not just as the powerful maker, but as the one who makes peace with the ruined creature. Where does that light, that specific grace, shine forth?
It is shown in the face of Christ, an allusion to 2 Corinthians 4.6, where God commands light to shine out of darkness. Here, in the person and work of Christ, God shows himself to be the Redeemer.
Okay.
It's through Christ's work that the Father's favor becomes accessible to us again, allowing us to truly experience him as the fountain of every good, and thus move beyond sheer terror of the awesome Creator.
So the structure is really clear.
It is. God as Creator, the primal knowledge revealed in nature, and God as Redeemer, the second, necessary knowledge revealed in Christ. The latter enables us to approach the former without being utterly consumed by guilt. The knowledge of the Redeemer restores the function of the knowledge of the Creator.
And while both types exist and are essential for a full theological picture, for the purpose of this initial discussion in Chapter 2, Calvin makes it clear that we're focusing on the obligation tied to the first aspect.
The necessary connection.
The necessary connection between the knowledge of God as Creator and the corresponding duty of piety. We must understand the demands of the Maker before we fully appreciate the grace of the Redeemer. The grace only makes sense when the demand is understood as absolute.
Well said.
That sets the table perfectly. We understand the requirement. True knowledge demands piety, which is induced by recognizing God as the source of all good. Now we move from definition to application. What does a life informed by this pious knowledge actually look like?
Moving from abstract knowledge to concrete action is vital for Calvin. He has no patience for intellectual games regarding the divine. The knowledge must compel action, or it's meaningless.
So where does he start?
First, we need to look at what true knowledge rejects. Calvin warns us about what the ancient Epicureans believed, leading to what we call the Epicurean trap. Why bother asking, what is God, if the resulting idea is merely speculative?
Right.
The danger is conceptualizing a God who has cast aside the care of the world only to amuse himself in idleness.
That sounds like deism, where God creates the clock, winds it up, and walks away. Why is this idea of an absentee landlord, a God amusing himself in idleness, so corrosive to piety?
It's the ultimate dismissal of sovereignty and providence. If God exists but has nothing to do with us, no care for our actions, no governance over the world, then knowing about him is functionally useless.
It has no bearing on my life.
None. If he is idle, he can't be the fountain of every good. Consequently, we're not compelled to seek anything from him, nor do we owe him reverence or fear. Piety is eliminated because dependence is eliminated.
So we need a God who is involved.
Calvin demands a God who is intensely involved in every minute detail of creation, a God of constant active providence. When we reject the Epicurean idea, we accept that his knowledge, wisdom, and might are continually exerted to govern, sustain, and guide everything.
And the consequence of realizing God as creator and governor is immediate and binding upon us.
It is.
Since we are his handiwork, we are made over and bound to his command by right of creation. This is a legal, inherent, and non-negotiable obligation. It's not an optional contract signed after the fact. It's the condition of being created. We belong to him because he made us.
The implication for our daily behavior is inescapable and comprehensive. It follows that your life is wickedly corrupt unless it be disposed to his service, because his will ought for us to be the law by which we live.
That's a strong statement.
It is. If we exist entirely by his will and for his purposes, any deviation from his command is not simply a mistake, but a fundamental corruption of our purpose and nature. This is a radical claim about the scope of divine authority over our time, talents, and desires.
It's also a warning against inventing a manageable God. If piety requires obedience, the pious mind must first know what God has commanded and revealed.
This is where the pious mind distinguishes itself from the merely philosophical or superstitious mind. The pious mind avoids making up a God it pleases, one that's easier to obey or less demanding.
Right, a God in our own image.
Instead, it contemplates the one and only true God, seeking him as he has presented himself in reality, not as an escape from reality.
So what does that look like in practice?
This commitment to the true God means holding tightly to revelation. The pious mind doesn't assign attributes arbitrarily, like declaring God is only mercy and never justice. It is content to hold him as he manifests himself.
That's a profound call for intellectual and spiritual humility.
And restraint in theological speculation. We must receive God as he is, not reconstruct him into a preference.
That insistence on restraint is crucial because human beings tend to want to go beyond what is written, either in adding traditions or in stripping away what's difficult to accept.
Yes, and Calvin says the pious mind exercises the utmost diligence and care not to wander astray, or rashly and boldly to go beyond his will. Piety means staying strictly within the boundaries set by God's own self-disclosure. It means fearing our own tendency toward arrogance and invention.
Okay, so with that intellectual and spiritual foundation set, we can now look at how this true knowledge manifests practically. You mentioned he doesn't leave this up to vague feeling.
Not at all. He details a six-fold response that dictates how we live, how we react to suffering, and how we view justice. This is the blueprint for the pious life.
Let's walk through these manifestations, starting with the core of relationship: absolute dependence and trust.
The first fruit is trust. The pious mind recognizes God governs all things providence in action. This knowledge translates directly into reliance.
Okay.
It trusts him as guide and protector, and therefore gives itself over completely to him. This is the antithesis of the anxiety caused by attempting to guide and protect oneself. If I truly believe God manages all things with wisdom and might, I surrender my own management attempts.
That transition from intellectual recognition of a governance to personal surrender is immediate and pervasive. If I struggle with worry about my future, my job, or my children, Calvin would point back to this first principle.
He'd say your pious knowledge is defective because you haven't fully yielded to his control as guide and protector.
Right. And the second response, seeking provision. This flows naturally from the realization of complete dependence.
It does. Acknowledging him as the author of every good, the pious mind immediately turns to his protection when lacking or oppressed. It doesn't resort to external or sinful means for comfort, security, or provision, but waits for help from the true source.
It's a reorientation of our seeking.
It's the recognition that suffering and lack are temporary circumstances, but the source of good is eternal and reliable.
Yeah.
This waiting is crucial. It's an active waiting, rooted in prayer and expectation, not passive resignation.
So when you lose a job or face an illness,
It forces you, the believer, to orient your seeking upward, rather than becoming cynical or attempting self-rescue through means you know God has forbidden.
the third response connects the relationship titles with action, reverence and obedience.
Yes, because the pious mind acknowledges him as Lord and Father. It deems it right to observe his authority, reverence his majesty, advance his glory, and obey his commandments.
The titles Lord and Father impose dual obligations, authority and affection.
Exactly. We obey out of respect for the power of the Lord, and we obey out of love for the care of the Father. That combination is potent.
And the service is comprehensive.
It is. It includes reverence, which is an internal attitude, advancing his glory, a public demonstration, and obeying his commandments, which are specific actions. Piety encompasses the entire person and every sphere of life.
The fourth manifestation brings in the serious reality of divine justice, fear of justice. This is often misinterpreted today as a purely negative, debilitating fear.
Right, but Calvin sees this as essential for a righteous life. The pious mind sees him as a righteous judge armed with severity. It holds his judgment seat before its gaze, restraining sin through fear.
So it's a healthy fear.
A healthy fear, born of respect for holiness and the absolute standard of righteousness, not just terror of personal penalty. It's the fear of offending the ultimate good. It's the fear of self-corruption.
Explain that.
A pious person, having established their complete happiness in God, recognizes that sinning is the most destructive act possible because it undermines the very relationship where their happiness resides. The fear of justice is the wisdom to avoid self-destruction.
But the knowledge of the judge must be balanced by the goodness of the Father. Otherwise, fear becomes paralyzing.
Which leads us to the fifth point, which is one of the hardest disciplines for humanity: acceptance of all his actions.
What does that mean in practical terms? It means the pious mind is not so terrified by judgment as to wish to withdraw or rail against God.
It embraces him, no less as punisher of the wicked than as benefactor of the pious. This is crucial for maintaining sincerity. A person with mere intellectual knowledge might love God when blessings are received, but resent or question him when suffering or justice arrives.
But the pious mind is different.
The pious mind, however, accepts his punitive actions, both in the world and potentially in their own experience, as entirely just and consistent with his character. They don't embrace cynicism or fatalism, but the conviction that every action, whether blessing or judgment, is consistent with his perfect character and wise providence.
To accept God as punisher requires a fundamental shift in how we perceive authority and fault. It means accepting that when things go wrong, the fault is not in the divine order, but in human sinfulness, or God's perfect right to govern his creation as he sees fit.
And that acceptance leads directly to the sixth and final point, which is the ultimate test of piety: ascribing glory to judgment.
Okay, unpack that.
The pious mind realizes that the punishment of the wicked and the reward of eternal life for the righteous equally pertain to God's glory. His holiness is magnified both in saving the just and condemning the unjust. His character is fully displayed in both outcomes.
So we can't glorify God fully if we only celebrate his mercy.
And deny his severity. A pious mind must be able to say, God is glorified when the wicked are punished, just as he is glorified when the righteous are rewarded.
That's a demanding discipline. It moves beyond self-interest entirely. My glory is tied up in my reward, but God's glory is displayed in both my reward and the necessary punishment of those who reject him.
That's it. This reinforces the objective nature of his glory. It exists independently of my subjective advantage.
Now, we must circle back to the central motivation for this piety because Calvin makes a radical claim about the sincerity of this sixfold response.
He does. The true pious mind restrains itself from sinning, not only from dread of punishment. This takes us back to the distinction between unwilling obedience and willing service.
Right.
Anyone can refrain from doing something they want to do simply because they fear the consequences. That's prudence, not piety. But the pious mind operates from a deeper relational principle, which, because it loves and reveres God as Father, it worships and adores him as Lord. The relationship and the honor due to the source of all good are primary. The external consequence is secondary.
And this is solidified by what might be the most challenging claim in the chapter, the ultimate measure of sincerity that Calvin applies to true religion.
Even if there were no hell, it would still shudder at offending him alone.
Stop and consider that statement. If the entire motivational structure of reward and penalty were removed, no heaven to gain, no hell to fear, the pious mind would still be restrained by the mere thought of offending the Creator.
The offense itself, the violation of the relationship with the ultimate good, is sufficient deterrent.
It forces us to ask, is my service driven by fear of consequence or by love for the author of every good thing?
That is the dividing line between superficial religion and real piety. It distinguishes the person seeking fire insurance from the person seeking union with God. If your service stops when the external pressure is removed, your piety was not genuine, it was utilitarian.
And this purity of motivation then ties directly into Calvin's final definition of real religion and sincerity.
It does. Real religion is defined as faith so joined with an earnest fear of God that this fear also embraces willing reverence, which carries with it legitimate worship as is prescribed in the law. It's internal disposition leading directly to external prescribed action, always driven by love and reverence.
And Calvin ends this section with a significant warning on how easily external show can mask internal deficiency. He stresses the warning that all men have a vague general veneration.
A sort of cultural or inherited respect for the divine.
Right, but very few really reverence him. They may have the words and the motions, but the internal piety is lacking.
This disparity between appearance and reality is vast, and it's a necessary warning for anyone examining their own spiritual state. Calvin warns that where there is great ostentation in ceremonies, sincerity of heart is rare indeed.
So the outward show can be a cover.
Excessive external display often compensates for a lack of internal piety, undermining the willing service and sincere trust that true knowledge requires. This final warning returns us perfectly to the beginning. Knowledge must change us internally. It must induce piety, a reverence joined with love, before any outward act of religion or worship can be considered genuine before the one and only true God.
We've completed a comprehensive deep dive into this crucial starting point of Reformed thought. We've clarified that knowing God is intensely relational and practical, demanding piety, a reverence joined with love, which flows from recognizing him as the singular author of all good. We saw that this knowledge imposes an inescapable obligation of service based on the right of creation, rejecting idle speculation about an absentee God. We detailed the 6 essential manifestations of that piety, ranging from trusting God as guide and source of provision to accepting his justice as a full demonstration of his glory, regardless of whether that justice is applied in blessing or in punitive judgment.
Yes, the pious mind embraces the whole of God's character as revealed.
It does.
The entire discussion established that real religion links faith and an earnest fear that translates into willing service and sincere reverence. Crucially, this motivation is so pure it transcends the need for external reward or penalty, finding its sole source of happiness in the relationship itself.
So, a final thought for our listeners.
As you conclude your study of this chapter, consider the final challenging point we uncovered, that the pious mind would still shudder at offending God, even if there were no hell.
That's the test.
It is. What does that tell you about the quality of your motivations when you choose service or avoidance of sin? Are your actions currently driven by fear of negative consequence, or by unadulterated love for the author of every good thing and reverence for his absolute majesty? That is the internal audit Calvin demands, something to consider as you proceed with your own reading and study.
Until the next deep dive, keep digging into the sources.